What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Although, today we're not going to be analyzing an apologist. We're going to analyze Thomas Westbrook's, or Holy Koolaid's, newest video on the historical evidence for Jesus. I think that most of the video is actually really good, but I do feel like Thomas missed the mark on a few points. Namely, a critical look at the evidence that Jesus even existed. So if y'all want to know where Holy Koolaid slipped up in his analysis of the historical evidence for Jesus, then please stay tuned. I first want to start off by reiterating that I think that most of the video is actually really good, especially if your target audience is a mixture of both Christians and atheists. Because while he does deny the miraculous claims of the Bible, he still asserts that Jesus existed in history. And most Christians are fine with atheists disregarding the miracle claims, just as long as they still accept that Jesus existed. At the beginning of his video, he compares the historical evidence we have for George Washington to the historical evidence we have for Jesus. He undoubtedly shows how preposterous of a claim it is to say that we have as much evidence for Jesus as we have for somebody like George Washington. But he does predicate this entire section with this statement.
But what he's really arguing is that the same method used to prove Washington or any historical figure is used to prove the existence of Jesus. And that's true, but the language is a little deceptive. Here's how. Just because we have the same methods and standards when it comes to proving historical figures doesn't mean that the caliber of evidence for them is the same. When proving the existence of any historical figure, not all evidence is created equal.
Now, this seems like a reasonable statement to make with one issue. Apologists and New Testament scholars absolutely do not use the same historical method for Jesus as they do for other historical figures. It's somewhat similar, but it's different enough to be considered wholly separate. They use criteria like the criterion of embarrassment or the criterion of dissimilarity in order to prove that things in the Bible historically happened. Just for instance, a lot of apologists and New Testament scholars claim that because Jesus was crucified, and that's an embarrassing idea, that definitely means that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. They also claim that Christianity couldn't have arisen unless Jesus was actually crucified by the Romans, because if it was made up, nobody would have believed it. This is the caliber of New Testament scholarship when it comes to proving historical aspects of Jesus. We have no evidence that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. We don't have any records from an eyewitness or secondary source that confirms that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. All New Testament scholarship can do is merely speculate about what was embarrassing to the first Jewish Christians without actually knowing what was embarrassing to them. And I mean, obviously it wasn't too embarrassing. We have several instances that we'll get into here in a little bit that show that early Christians had no problem changing the story around in order to meet their theological needs. So if something was considered embarrassing, then they would have removed it. And this is because they have removed things in the past. They've also added things. Another thing is that with the historicity of Jesus, all New Testament scholarship can do is speculate that Paul was talking about a historical Jesus. They ad hoc assert that Paul identified people as disciples of Jesus. Paul never gives a clear indication about either of these things. They also speculate that the Gospels are based on real accounts, yet we don't have any evidence they were based on anything other than the Scriptures, which would be the Old Testament. And finally, one of the more important aspects of all of this is that most New Testament scholars are actually bound by statements of faith. What this means is that they have to do whatever they have to do in order to maintain their adherence to that statement of faith. This means that you really can't trust them to give you good information. That doesn't mean that good scholarship doesn't exist in New Testament scholarship. It just means that it's really, really hard to find. Because all the time you have New Testament scholars that disregard good scholarship and assert really bad scholarship in its place. Some assert that all four Gospels are independent accounts, and others say the Gospels are not anonymous works. New Testament scholarship is notoriously bad at applying the same historical method you would apply to other historical figures.
Now, while you might be tempted to point to the Shroud of Turin, that's unfortunately been debunked by scientists multiple times. The cloth was carbon dated to no earlier than the 13th century, over 1,200 years after Jesus' death. And forensic analysis of the blood patterns don't match crucifixion wounds.
This is an example of how Thomas knows how to do the academic research needed for this topic. I agree with his assessment here, and he even brings up the scientific studies that show that the Shroud of Turin is a forgery. This is the kind of academic research that should be applied to an analysis of the evidence for Jesus.
Do we at least have contemporary first-hand accounts written during his lifetime by eyewitnesses?
Well, no, we don't. We don't have any contemporary eyewitness evidence of Jesus. Paul is not an eyewitness, but he is a contemporary. We should see some reference to his earthly ministry or even Jesus' disciples, but in Paul, we don't find any of that. All we find in Paul are references to a celestial Jesus. There are vague references that apologists regularly cite in order to show that Paul was placing Jesus on earth, but upon a critical analysis of these references, they probably don't do that. I'll cover one of those references later on in the video. Thomas then goes on to give a really good analysis of the gospel evidence, but he kind of falters on this one part. This timeline that Thomas presents is not representative of the best dates that we have for the gospels. First of all, the timeline makes it seem like we have harder dates for the Gospels than we actually do. Typically what you have are date ranges that we can place the Gospels in. For instance, the best that we can say about Mark is that it was written after 70 CE. Matthew was written at some point during the 80s, and Luke has to have been written after 93 CE due to his reliance on Josephus. That leaves the Gospel of John as being written not in the 90s, but rather in the 2nd century. Understanding the time frames in which the Gospels were written is essential in understanding how we don't know what's fact or fiction in the Gospels. From here, Thomas does an excellent analysis of the 500 witnesses in 1 Corinthians. We don't have 500 accounts. We have one anecdotal account that was told either second or third hand to Paul. This would be the weakest type of evidence. But then Thomas goes on to say this.
Paul doesn't give a detailed account of the life or teachings of Jesus, but he talks about him as a real person, a teacher with disciples who was killed and rose from the dead. But he also says in Galatians 1 that he didn't learn the teachings of Jesus firsthand, and he didn't get it from any of the disciples either, but instead got all of his information through divine revelation.
The only problem that I have with this section is that he speaks of Paul as referring to Jesus as a historical figure, but Paul doesn't do that. Paul doesn't talk about Jesus as a teacher with disciples. In fact, he never even uses the word disciple for anybody in his writings, nor does he indicate that anybody was an eyewitness of Jesus on earth. Paul only ever references Jesus as a celestial figure. Now, Galatians 4:4 is often cited as proving that Paul was mentioning Jesus being born of a woman, but that's a superficial examination of the passage. The full context of that passage is an allegory. In Paul's view, God did send his son in a human body that was bound to the laws of Moses and the other patriarchs. But this was allegorical imagery in order to communicate to people how Jesus and his sacrifice destroys that old law and establishes a new path into heaven. Removing Galatians 4:4 from its full context makes no sense and only reveals a poor exegesis of the passage. Basically, it's quote mining. Thomas then provides an excellent explanation as to why eyewitness accounts can't necessarily be trusted. He also demonstrates why they are some of the poorest pieces of evidence. Yet, in history, Oftentimes that's all that we have. But then Thomas says this.
And for the first several decades, that's exactly how the stories of the gospel were spread. From the original eyewitnesses of whatever actually happened to a decades-long game of telephone among largely illiterate religious fanatics.
Now, this is a misrepresentation of how the gospels were constructed. First, it assumes a real historical basis without proving that there was a historical basis. This explanation ignores how very literate and educated Jews like Paul constructed the theology of Christianity, but also the mythological story of Jesus. These weren't largely illiterate religious fanatics. Well, they may have been fanatics, but they were not illiterate. This explanation ignores the fact that the Gospels are largely constructed out of Old Testament stories. All the miracles of Jesus and even some of the theological tenets of Christianity come directly from the Old Testament. We all know the golden rule from the New Testament, but in case you weren't aware, that's actually derived from the Old Testament. And it was around way before the Old Testament. The fact that Jesus came to die, resurrect, and absolve all the sins, mainly for the Jews, is all contained in the Old Testament. Jesus healing lepers, healing the blind, resurrecting people, and feeding thousands with very little food, all derived from the miracles that are listed in the Old Testament. My point is that this requires an intimate knowledge of Jewish theology and the scriptures. Treating the original Jewish Christians as if they were illiterate and uneducated is simply a misrepresentation. Acting as if there were real historical events behind the Gospels rips the Gospels away from their Old Testament roots. The simple description given in this section ignores a lot of information we know about the Gospels and their authorship. One would think that he would apply the same academic rigor here as he does with the Shroud of Turin.
By the time you get from the first witness to the writing of the original copies, we don't know how much had changed or been fabricated, and we don't even have these original written copies.
Again, he is assuming that there was a first witness. He's right that we don't know how much the Gospels changed from the time they were written until the 4th century. Fragments from the 2nd century can really only confirm what was in the Gospels for those respective sections. But we do know for certain that most, if not all, of the Gospels were fabricated using the scriptures. This is a proven fact at this point. Assuming without any evidence that there was an eyewitness is just speculation and doesn't help us at all. You can speculate about anything that way and accept it as truth.
You see, you know how I said that Paul's letters were probably written around 55 CE, Mark around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 85 CE, and John around 90 CE? Well, we don't have any of those original texts.
He's right, we don't. And I've already mentioned how the dates he has listed are wrong. Here's an important point though. We don't need the original texts. Given our current information about the Gospels and Paul's writings, we've been able to determine that some of the passages in Paul have been interpolated. And we've even been able to reconstruct some passages in the Gospels. For instance, we know that the longer ending of Mark wasn't originally there. And that famous scene in the Gospel of John where Jesus protects Mary Magdalene from being stoned was an original to that document. In fact, I would be totally content that Jesus existed if Paul had unambiguously referenced Jesus as a historical figure. I mean, it would be totally antithetical to Paul's message and all of his epistles, but I would at least accept that Jesus existed. We don't have that though. Thomas goes on from here to give an excellent summary of the Christian texts and codices that we currently have. But then we have this.
Even still, without the originals, there are multiple accounts written about Jesus and an entire cult following that we know sprung up around this figure. Sure, the Gospels and letters of Paul are biased religious accounts, but they are still multiple sources writing around this time period about a specific teacher named Jesus who had disciples who they claimed lived in Israel and was executed. In terms of ancient history, that actually seems really good.
This section is all wrong. First, while there are multiple accounts of this Jesus figure, they all really only absolve to one account. That would be Paul's account. And this would be after applying the same historical method that you would apply to other historical figures. Paul's account of Jesus is the singular account that we have of Jesus. The Gospels ultimately all derive off of Paul's work, because Mark used Paul to generate his gospel, and the other gospels used Mark in order to inform their theology and their story. Now, that's not to say that Paul invented Jesus or anything. There obviously were Christians in existence prior to Paul, but I think that they came about the information about Jesus the exact same way that Paul did. That would be through revelation and through reading the scriptures. There exists in Jewish theology an archangel figure that is described exactly the same way as Jesus is described as the Messiah. And as Paul claims, the Jews were searching through the scriptures in order to find information about the Jewish Messiah. Second, considering that the Gospels are later editions of the Jesus story, you can't really use those as proof that Jesus had disciples. Again, Paul doesn't mention any disciples, nor does he mention any eyewitness of Jesus in history. So, as far as we can tell from the singular account that we have, Jesus didn't have disciples or even a ministry until after he resurrected. Finally, even if we only had the account of Paul, that would be more than enough to prove that Jesus existed in history. The problem is that Paul doesn't place Jesus in history. Paul only ever talks about Jesus as a celestial figure. So, just to recap here, our singular account of this Jesus figure is not a historical reference, but rather a theological reference. That doesn't seem good at all for a historical figure.
Not George Washington level good by any stretch, but especially when compared to other famous historical figures from this time period who we don't have any text about until several hundred years after their life, or who we may only have one or two accounts for.
But this isn't true either. The best example of how wrong this statement is concerns Alexander the Great. The best biography written about Alexander the Great doesn't come until 500 years after his death. But the reason why it's considered one of the best biographies about his life is because Arrian, the author of the biography, used first-hand eyewitness accounts of Alexander's life. In fact, we know exactly who it was. It was two of Alexander the Great's generals. Arrian used their first-hand accounts of Alexander the Great in order to construct his information about Alexander. Those two first-hand eyewitness sources for Alexander the Great don't exist to us now, but we do have access to them through Arrian's work. So, while this biography was written hundreds of years after Alexander the Great died, we still have reliable information from first-hand accounts. Nothing at all like this exists for Jesus. So no, when compared to other historical figures at the time, Jesus does not have the same quantity or quality of evidence. In my Crestus app, I actually compared the evidence for Jesus to the evidence that we have for other historical figures like Julius Caesar or Hannibal. Needless to say, the evidence for Jesus doesn't even come close to the evidence that we have for other historical figures.
And in the case of Jesus, we also have some secular accounts mentioning him that were probably originally written within about 100 years of Jesus' life, like the Annals of Tacitus, Mara's letter to Serapion, a brief mention by Pliny the Younger, and of course 2 mentions by the Jewish historian Josephus, but at least one of those mentions is widely believed to be at least a partial forgery.
Alright, so let's go through these secular sources one by one. This is going to be a rough overview of why these sources don't actually prove that Jesus existed in history. I mentioned my Crestus app before. If you want a more in-depth look at it, I suggest you go and download that app so you can get more information. But even Christian New Testament scholars do not use Tacitus in order to prove that Jesus existed in history. Robert Van Voorst is one of these Christian New Testament scholars, and he tells us that Tacitus assumed that Jesus existed in history, and he didn't bother to fact check a thing. Another noteworthy thing to point out is that Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century and would have ultimately gotten his information from Christians. Now, I happen to believe that that particular passage in Tacitus was tampered with, and it never really mentioned Christ originally. It only mentioned Chrestus and the Christians. Regardless of that position, the reasonable and rational point of view of Tacitus is that he's only regurgitating what he's been told, and not that he's researched the historical nature of what he's been told. Next, Marbar Serapion was most likely writing in the 2nd century, but he also reveals that he gets his information from Christians themselves by stating that the Jews killed their wise king. That information only ever appears in the Gospels. According to Paul's epistles, demons and Satan, they are the ones that crucified Jesus in the firmament of the heavens, but that's a much longer conversation to be had. Marbar Serapion doesn't mention any kind of first-hand information or sources for this wise Jewish king. And by the time he was writing, it would have all been common knowledge at that point. And then we get to Pliny the Younger. He also was writing in the 2nd century, and he was interrogating Christians at the time. And so Pliny the Younger was only mentioning Christians and what they believed. Not that these things happened in history, just that these are the Christians, here's what they believe, and here's what they do. This is not evidence that he existed in history. This is evidence that Christians existed in the 2nd century, which we already know. And finally, Josephus is a bit more complicated than the others. It basically boils down to both accounts being interpolated. One of them being wholly inserted, and the other one being unintentionally interpolated. I actually have an extensive video refuting Josephus as evidence of Jesus. It'll be linked in the cards and in the description, so if you want to learn more about that, I suggest watching that video. Oh, I forgot to cover the little note that he had on the screen for the longest time, because it actually refutes itself. The fact that these ambiguous sources that he lists in this note were written in the 2nd or 3rd century means that you can't use them as historical evidence for Jesus. By that time, all 4 Gospels were readily available to the Christian community. The first primitive New Testament collection of books was made available by the mid-2nd century. So everything about Jesus contained in the Gospels was common knowledge. The fact that the euhemerization of Jesus into history occurs so early works against the historicist position, because this means that we need evidence prior to the popularization of Jesus. And that only leaves us with Paul's writings. And again, I'm simply applying the same historical method that we would apply to other historical figures at the time. This type of source criticism is integral to historical research.
That said, if we're being objective and we apply the same historical methods to Jesus as we would to Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, Socrates, or any other figure, is it still safe to assume that he existed?
Well, no. This is due to the fact that our only source for Jesus before his euhemerization doesn't ever place him in history. Applying the same historical method to Jesus as we would for other historical figures would mean that his existence is definitely up for debate. And we do this for all historical figures. There hasn't been one historical figure whose existence hasn't been questioned. The problem with Jesus is that he doesn't have anywhere near the amount of evidence he's often claimed to have.
Well, if an archaeologist finds a 2,500-year-old written account about a king who allegedly lived 2,700 years ago, unless there's some strong reason to doubt it, that single account is usually enough to tentatively accept them as a potential historical figure. For example, if you find a king's list with a genealogy naming successive kings, even if it's just the mention of a name, that's usually good enough. But if you have 2 accounts, then you're probably golden. Yes, there is more that goes into it, like source criticism, where you ask things like when and where was the text produced, who wrote it, what was their bias/credibility level, what's the genre of the text, and where did they pull their material from. But I would argue at this point that if we're simply asking if Jesus probably existed or not, then by most universally applied historical standards, I'd have to lean towards yes, because people existing isn't a far-fetched wild claim.
Okay, so here's what I don't get. Clearly, he understands that source criticism is integral to historical research, so it would seem pertinent to apply those questions he listed to the sources he mentioned. If he were to apply those questions to the sources he mentioned, it seems like he would rule them all out. However, as Thomas said, existing isn't a far-fetched claim, and so he seems to forego the need to apply those questions to the sources. While I agree that existing is not a far-fetched claim, that is not the claim that's being made with the evidence that we have. The original claim being made is that Paul was visited by a celestial figure named Jesus, and then he read the scriptures in order to obtain more information about this celestial figure. That's not just a claim that a human named Jesus existed and preached to people. That's a far-fetched claim that's akin to Joseph Smith claiming Moroni visited him, or any other cult leader that was visited by some kind of celestial figure.
In fact, billions of people do it every day, and larger-than-life cult figures spring up all the time. They attract massive followings and have religions form around them. Why should Jesus be any different?
No, Jesus shouldn't be placed in the same position as other cult leaders. Comparing Christianity to Mormonism, Jesus would be the angel Moroni, and Paul would be Joseph Smith. You see, Moroni visited Joseph through a vision and then imparted information on him as his apostle. And then you see, Jesus visited Paul through a vision and imparted information onto him as his apostle. Do you see the connection here? For all that I can tell, Jesus was only ever a celestial figure. So I feel like it's totally incorrect to place Jesus in the same position as Joseph Smith or other cult leaders.
But the burden of proof for existence is a lot lower than the burden of proof for the virgin birth, miracle working, being a god, and rising from the dead.
I agree. The burden of proof for somebody existing is a lot lower than proving miraculous claims. But the original claim being made is not the mundane act of existing. The original claim being made is that a celestial figure named Jesus imparted new information onto his apostles, like Paul, Peter, and others, through visions and by them reading the scriptures. How exactly is this not just like Mormonism?
Because we know that gurus and prophets and faith healers con people left and right. Right here, right now, in the 21st century. They use sleight of hand, the placebo effect, mass hysteria, and other forms of psychological manipulation, magic tricks, bold-faced lies, cold reading, and various forms of technology. They talk themselves up, take credit for things that they didn't do, and also rely on their followers to inflate stories about them through word of mouth.
Now, I agree with everything that Thomas just said. I just still don't understand why he asserts Jesus' existence as not a fantastical claim just like all of the others he listed. Paul's claims about Jesus are just as crazy as that pink-haired prophet lady. Close your eyes. Imagine a man comes to you one day and he claims that Cletus appeared to him, and that with Cletus' sacrifice, all sins have been forgiven, and everlasting life could only be attained by worshiping him. And you worshipped him by eating pork rinds and drinking Bud Light. We would need good evidence that such a person ever existed, or even died. And given the evidence in my example, we shouldn't just automatically believe that Cletus lived. This is the caliber of evidence that we are working with. I want to say that I really like Thomas's video. It provides a lot of great information. I think that everybody should go and watch it and soak up all that good information. But I also recommend you keep my comments here in mind when watching his video. His video is linked down below in the description, so definitely head on over there and let him know what a good job he did on the video. That's going to be it for me today, heathens. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you think about Thomas's video. Let me know what you think about the information that I've supplied here. And hey, if you haven't already downloaded the Crestus app, definitely go and check that out today. But before you do that, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.